Timbuktu may be 4,000 kilometers from Europe's shores, yet how to keep the Sahel safe is a question that needs answers on both sides of the Mediterranean. It's telling that Germany's chancellor skipped Tuesday's One Planet summit in Paris, but was bang on time the following day in the French capital for this gathering of the G5 Sahel, the leaders of Mauritania, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger and Chad, some of the poorest nations on earth, which need the means and know-how to patrol the Sahara and take on insurgents that dabble in jihad, trafficking, and people smuggling. Nearly 5 years after French-led forces chased radicals out of northern Mali, why is it still so hard to train and equip local soldiers? Who pays for it all? And what's the vision for developing the Sahel? The battle of public opinion in these forlorn lands cannot be won with just a military plan. Today in the France 24 debate, how to patrol the Sahara. And with us to talk about it, Dugukolo Bakonare. He teaches civilization studies at the Modern Language Institute INALCO, and you're also the president of Kizal, which promotes human rights and networking among more than just the Fulani communities of the Sahel.
Yeah, well, we started out of nomadic communities in general, but now we have to work with the neighbors as well. So we're trying to be inclusive in the Sahel region, anything pertaining to human rights abuses, to basic necessities.
All right, well, pleasure to have you. Pleasure to welcome back a former foreign minister who's, well, we could say it, has since had a falling out with Chad's president. Ashek Im Umar, always a pleasure. How are you?
Thank you for this new invitation.
And from Washington, Michael Shurkin, senior political analyst with the RAND Corporation. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, the hashtag F24debate. The plan is to have 7 battalions, 2 in the eastern part of that G5, 2 in the west, and 3 in the central areas, covering Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. Former colonial power France currently has 4,000 troops in the area as part of Operation Barkhane, the plan to eventually draw down while bolstering local forces. It's a France 24 report read by Wassim Cornet.
The men and women of the Special Forces come here for 4 months. They know how their missions operate, but they need to get used to the terrain, to the climate, and to the vegetation. Anything that could play a role in their missions.
The mission here is to stop those vehicles and to neutralize the threat, not destroy it. That's our priority, catching enemy fighters and using them to retrieve intelligence.
The drill involves capturing a terrorist fighter. The man has dropped his weapon and has surrendered. He must now be interrogated and have his identity checked. A few meters away, using his radio, the section chief checks each soldier's abilities. In just a few days, these tasks will be carried out during real missions. In the desert north of the Niger River, the training exercise continues. The hunt for terrorists is based on intelligence that is collected. Commandos are flexible and the chain of command is short, so everything can change in the blink of an eye. Operations can be prepared for weeks or launched in just 1 hour.
These patrols intervene at the forefront of all counterterrorism operations because they allow us to catch enemies that are becoming harder and harder to apprehend.
For the past 4 years now, the French Special Forces have been carrying out Operation Sabre in almost total secrecy.
All right, those training exercises taking place, Dugukolo Bakonare, again, the idea is more and more for the French to take a backstage role and for local forces to be doing these jobs. What's the situation right now on the ground? It's been nearly 5 years since the French intervened to chase the jihadists from northern Mali.
Well, in Mali, the situation, I think, is becoming worse and worse. And this is something that could have been anticipated even a few years ago. We had been talking about people being victimized by armed groups, proponents of armed jihad, but there are also human rights abuses by the army, by soldiers. So right now, you have a situation where civilians aren't that ready to welcome new forces.
Worse and worse, even though there is this UN force, MINUSMA, which is present there.
Well, I think that MINUSMA, they didn't have a mandate to operate in across the whole country. They were mainly supposed to deal with the the northern regions of the country. But then they expanded their scope of operation, and now they have a logistics office that's in charge of the center as well. And anyway, their missions aren't about chasing terrorists. Basically, what they do is protecting civilians, and they also have a whole civilian-based operation, strengthening the civil society. And in most of the places where the situation is getting worse, it's something very pragmatic. People are facing violence every day, and it's not a
Violence from whom?
Violence from armed groups mainly. And what happens is these armed groups aren't trying to gain, any city. They're not trying to take over. They're staying in rural areas, and they're occupying some cities and villages, but not.
What's their aim? What's the aim of these armed groups?
I
What do
think
they
that
want?
the aim now is really to ensconce terror and to promote their ideology of jihad. This is what they say. There may be other agendas, but what's working for them right now is the fact that even the national army is afraid to go in certain places, and the civilians don't feel comfortable enough to be cooperating. And the situation that the civilians are in right now makes it so that their everyday lives are completely dismantled. So in that sense, they were able to create a balance of terror in that area, and the governments aren't working, I guess.
Michael Shurkin, listening to Dugokolo Bakonare, did you see this coming, what he's describing in the north of Mali?
Unfortunately, yes. We've seen ever since 2013 just a degradation of the situation, in part having to do with the fact that the Malian government, the Malian military, has not been able to get itself into the kind of shape that it needs to be in order to operate effectively there. Now, it's because the French forces are woefully insufficient for the geographic area that's as vast as the Sahel. First of all, Barkhane's only 4,000 soldiers. It's not just Mali, it's the entire Sahel, which is roughly the size of it's as wide as the United States is wide, which means that there's not a lot one can expect the French to be able to do. And there's not much that even MINUSMA, which is larger, can be expected to do in that kind of situation. So you have a very complex, very violent situation that's degrading a lot of people who don't have a vested interest in peace. And you have security forces that are completely not up to all of the challenges that are in front of them.
Not all the challenges that are in front of them. Ashekim Noumar, your native Chad,
Yeah.
it's got tensions on three fronts, right? You've got, on the one hand, the areas bordering Niger. On the other hand, your border with Libya. And, of course, to the south, there's Nigeria, where Boko Haram is present.
And you may add a fourth front, it's Central Africa, which is right on the southern border of Chad. Exactly, we are at the center of this destabilization phenomenon across the Sahelian region. But the problem is that these groups that called jihadis or terrorists, they represent a symptom rather than essential reality. I think that there is a mistake in treating the phenomenon as a military one and just focusing on military solution. Military solutions are effective when it comes to military problems, but the basic problem in this area is the states are fragile essentially, and there is no rule of law. The youth and the rural population feel disenfranchised. Whole swathes of territory are abandoned by the state. There is no administrative presence of the state of social services.
And more soldiers aren't going to solve that.
Except for the occasional tax collector or custom raids, etc. So there is the problem of state building in this area, I think, which need more focus.
But isn't this a conversation we've had, over 6 decades now?
Yeah.
State building, this conversation about state building.
Well, the problem is that, as Mr. Bakonare said, after putting forward some kind of very impressive solutions sometimes. But after, a few years, we have to, realize that the situation has gotten worse and worse. And there is a proverb back home who said that she intended to help the bride with her makeup, but ended up bursting her eyes.
All right. So on that score, let's listen to what France's president had to say at the summit. Emmanuel Macron reminding his audience that this was the fruit of a meeting on the sidelines of a recent Africa-EU summit in Ivory Coast.
We have to win this war against terror in the Sahel-Sahara region, a war that's in full swing. There are attacks every day, states that are threatened. The terrorist threat is very real, and we want to intensify the efforts to fight them with this new formula, a partnership between the EU and African states. This is the goal. This is why we'll see our first victories in the first months of 2018.
What's your reaction there to the tone of the French president?
Well, I think that, we're all talking about terrorists and we're all talking about this kind of war against their threats. But we really have to discriminate between the different people, the different actors, different people acting violence in the field. Some of these people that are being called terrorists, they have so many different agendas. And I think that...
Yeah, there's even like they're talking about what the expression we discovered in 2013, those who didn't follow it closely, was narco-terrorists. Right?
Yeah, that was also
the idea is that
some
people
time.
who sometimes traffickers and sometimes ideologically driven.
Yeah, so it's very opportunistic sometimes. And some other times, people don't have a choice. They get into these groups because the people saying that they're proponents of jihad just get there and they threaten, they say, if you speak about what we're doing here, and if you communicate with the government and officials, we're going to come back for you. And there's a certain sense of regularity in the way that they operate. They come every now and then, they say what's prohibited, they say what they want to do, and they respect their word, which is something that's hard to say for other actors in the field. So yeah, I think that there's a problem with governance, and we do have to be very careful in the use of force. But one other thing that I would like to add in is that in terms of military operation, we can all agree that things have to be very surgical. We have to be cautious, but at the same time, there's not going to be any presence of any state agents in the area if there's not a minimum of security, because people are afraid. It's not only that they feel like they're being left out of development. People right now, there is not a lot that they can do. And, most of them, they're very humble. What they want may not even be, the minimum in terms of development. Yeah, a hospital is a good thing, but sometimes people just want to be able to do their basic activities, farm, bring the cattle to pasture areas, and be left alone, have birth certificates.
In safety.
Yeah, they want to be in safety. And if you want to build anything, you need to have that minimum. So I think that security is something that's necessary, but we have to try to negotiate the right ways to have an intervention.
All right, so on that score, Michael Shurkin, do you take the point by Ashik Ibn Umar that the response right now is too military-driven when you listen to the announcements that have come out of this summit?
I think that's correct. To be fair, France says very explicitly that security is only one side of this, that they also say that governance and development are those are the three pillars of the stool upon which they wish to build their counterterrorism strategy. This is true. The problem is that the tendency is really to focus on the security side of that. It's a tendency that France has. It's a tendency certainly that the United States has. And so there's much less focus on the development piece of this triad, as well as the governance or the politics piece of this triad. Even the fact that we're here ostensibly to talk about the G5 force rather than to talk about the EU strategy for political engagement or economic development, I think is an indicator of that. So if you want to ask
that a mistake?
Me, well, what is France's strategy for economic development in the region? Yeah, I think it's a big mistake. If you look at, the problems, it's so much bigger than just terrorism, Islamism, or narco-terrorism. You have pastoralists who are fighting farmers because of land disputes. You have all sorts of different communities that perceive that they're fighting one another in some zero-sum game contest. How do you manage that? How do you arbitrate that? There has to be various forms of governance to arbitrate that. How are those problems being addressed by mounting an improved military operation? We don't have the answers to that. But so I think I agree with both of the other guests that we need to be worried about all these other things and not just focus on the military and the security side, even though the security side is absolutely essential.
All right, when we come back, we're going to take a look at those who are present in Paris, those who are not, because that matters as well. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate.
Eye on Africa, presented by Georgia Calvin Smith.
Africa News, and your eyes on Africa. And bringing you the latest from across the continent.
Eye on Africa, on France 24 and France24.com.
What do you want from your news website? France24.com, giving you easier access to information and faster for a unique experience. France24.com, the international news website.
We are journalists, and normally you have to listen to us, but you have things to tell us too. Maybe you've experienced a dramatic event, or you've got something important to say. You want to make a difference. That is why we created The Observers. Now, the first step is very easy. You get in touch with our team. Send us your images, tell us what you've seen. And then it's our job to get your voice out there, on our site, on social networks, on your mobiles and tablets, and on TV, of course. You can appear in our weekly show via webcam. Or perhaps we'll come see you in person, where you live, in your country, your town, and we'll work together on a report for our investigative show, The Observers Direct. So you get the idea. This show is your show, your way to get your voice out to the world.
People and Profit, presented by Stephen Carroll.
Business news is not about numbers, nor percentages and statistics. Business news is about people and how we live our lives. People and Profit goes beyond numbers to analyze how the global flow of money and profits shape our world. Intelligent and accessible, the show cuts across business, economics and politics.
People and Profit, on France 24 and France24.com.
Because a new page of history gets written every day. Because breaking news can't wait. Information. Everywhere. In all situations. On every subject. Understanding the world. Imagining the world. France 24, a different take on the news.
Welcome back. Before we resume the France 24 debate, some of the stories we're following for you with Laura Cellier in the newsroom. Muslim nations meeting in Istanbul call for the recognition of East Jerusalem as capital of a Palestinian state, the response to Donald Trump's decision to move his embassy to Jerusalem. The U.S. Federal Reserve expected to announce a rate hike in the coming hour. Our business editor, Kate Moody, will have more on that. Chris Froome's Vuelta title in question. The UK cycling champion denies wrongdoing after reports reveal asthma medication twice above the allowed limit on a stage of this past year's Tour of Spain. Mostly rave reviews as Star Wars: The Last Jedi opens in theaters worldwide, the 9th film of the sci-fi saga, expected to once again break box office records. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, and Well, it's summit week for Emmanuel Macron. On Tuesday, it was the One Planet Summit. On Thursday and Friday, a big EU summit where Brexit will be on the agenda. And wedged in between, an important summit ahead of the March launch of the G5 Sahel joint force to patrol that vast expanse of West Africa. With us to talk about it, Dougou Koloba Konare, who teaches civilization studies at the Modern Language Institute INALCO and president of the advocacy group Kizal. Also with us, Ashek Im Umar, Chad's former foreign minister. Welcome back. Welcome back as well to Michael Shurkin, who joins us from Washington, senior political analyst at the Rand Corporation. At that summit, that took place in the suburbs of Paris this Wednesday, the French president announcing a donor conference for next February and new pledges that have come in from Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Saudi Arabia putting $100 million on the table. That's what, 1/5 of the total tab for this G5. Dougou Koloba Konare, what was your reaction when you saw that announcement by the Saudis?
Well, it's still short of the total amount of money that they're trying to get anyway. But this is something that people have been talking about. There's been a lot of chatter. And yesterday I was at a conference and some of the members of the audience were saying that, oh, why are we getting money from Saudi Arabia when we know that some groups linked to Saudi Arabia are defending and promoting ideas of Wahhabism.
Yeah, but when the France 24 debate went to Gao in 2013, the locals were very upset, saying, they've promoted this Wahhabism for decades here, and that's part of the problem.
Well, the Wahhabism didn't start with the crisis. Some of the preachers first came in the region some 60 years ago, and there was a lot of bilateral aid by Saudi Arabia. So I think it's very difficult to just have a dualistic view of the problem. I think that Saudi Arabia now is also trying to transition into another kind of governance. They're trying to mete out some form of punishment to officials and even key leaders of the regime that have been accused of wrongdoings. And from what I understood, people here in Paris and on the political stage are saying, we just need the money through, so we're going to take it.
Ashik Mumar?
We all remember that in June, when what is called the Gulf crisis started between Qatar and Saudi Arabia and the Emirates. On the other hand, some countries in the Sahel region, they aligned themselves with the Saudi Arabia. And the government of Chad went as far as to cut off all diplomatic relationship with Qatar. So we should put all this in the context of the Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates trying to have more influence in the region and to have more and more African countries on their side in their confrontation
buying
with
influence
Qatar.
Is what you're saying.
Yeah. But anyway, it is not bad news that this announcement of Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates contributing financially to the G5. But I just want to point at that the United Arab Emirates a couple of weeks ago acquired that Da Vinci's canvas, and the price was about the $400 million, about the same amount that what is needed for the G5. So I think that they could do more than that.
Yeah, that one painting was the 30 million, by the way, that the UAE is putting up. Michael Shurkin is for a military academy in Mauritania. Your thoughts? Altruism showing that the Saudis and the Emiratis have changed their stripes, or is it buying influence?
I think it's a little bit of the above. I mean, I think all of us agree that when Saudi and any of these Gulf states announce that they're going to help in this region, that there's a little bit of irony there because of the role in the area has not always been so benevolent. but this isn't bad news that they're giving money. Any little bit helps. I would question the utility of a military academy in Mauritania. I also wonder about the coordination of this money. Is the money being handed to a single entity that's going to disperse it according to a certain strategy, or are all these donors going to act individually? I think there are lots of questions that need to be asked.
Why do you question the utility of a military academy in Mauritania?
Well, one of the problems that the countries of the Sahel have is that all of them have been trained by different countries separately. Some units might get some French training, some American training. All the senior officers in the Malian military, for instance, have been trained by the Soviets. You've got a hodgepodge of training, doctrine, different perspectives. It doesn't necessarily add up to anything. So having another country come up with another school to teach some other way doesn't necessarily do anybody any good. Same problem with the EUTM, the European Union Training Mission, which is in Mali and elsewhere in Niger. What are they training? They're training their own doctrines. I think it's individual countries are training their own kind of way. There's not necessarily any kind of cohesion or planning or thought put into what exactly do we need to be teaching these militaries, and what are the best practices, what are the best doctrines, what are the best tactics, etc. So another military school, maybe that's useful, but I have to be skeptical.
All right. By the way, you mentioned the EU, you mentioned France, the US. There's another precinct heard from at this summit, Germany. Its chancellor, Angela Merkel, signaling her country's, again, further evidence of its move towards a more activist policy when it comes to military matters on the world stage.
Security is also the precondition for economic development. Between 2017 and 2021, Germany will provide about 1 billion in development aid. But this will not help if people cannot live in security. That is why we have a fundamental interest in the ability to guarantee security in the region.
Michael Shurkin, your thoughts on the fact that we saw Angela Merkel in Paris for this summit, but not for the One Planet summit on Tuesday?
I won't speculate about Merkel's thoughts on the One Planet Summit, but I do know that Merkel has a very keen interest in strengthening her bilateral relationship with France and with President Macron. It's very important. And showing unity with security matters is also very important. So putting boots on the ground, German boots on the ground in the Sahel, helping France out with its security mission. I think that regardless of how Germany feels about Africa, it's in Germany's interest, according to Merkel, to strengthen its relationship with France and to be there for France and with France. That said, Merkel is also interested in doing what she can to address the refugee crisis, which is affecting both Germany and Europe, some of which comes out of the Sahel. There are a host of reasons why Merkel wants to be there and wants Germany to play a more active role. And I would say that this is a good thing. This is good for the region. It's also good for France and good for Germany.
Dukokolo Bakonare, on the hashtag F24 debate, some skeptical saying, the fact that Merkel and also Gentiloni, the Prime Minister of Italy, were there, it shows that this isn't really about increasing security and safety in countries like yours, Mali, but rather this is to make sure that more migrants don't cross the Mediterranean.
Well, I think we have to look at things in a larger scope. Now there are plans to renegotiate the way that Europe is protecting itself, the European defense programs. And the idea here is for Germany to offer some money and to offer some influence, into that bag, and for France to take the leadership in terms of defense. So this is a kind of experiment in a way, where France is deploying the troops and Germany comes in support. But the one thing that I would like to hear more from European countries is what are they suggesting in terms of policy on the field? What are they telling France? What are they giving France in terms of recommendations in exchange for their financial support? And this is a little bit different from Saudi Arabia. I really do believe that Saudi Arabia's involvement isn't solely about the African countries and spreading their influence. I think that there's also a bilateral aspect, Saudi Arabia and France. And I think that in that sense,
much in the way that Michael just said, there's a bilateral aspect between France and Germany.
Yeah, and I think that between Saudi Arabia and France as well. And in that situation, we're kind of, a sort of funnel, through which they communicate together. And one other thing that I would like to add is that Saudi Arabia in that region, it's true that they've been doing a lot of work for a long time. They've been accused of a lot of things, but people in the field, not necessarily in big cities, people in rural areas, it's not Saudi Arabia that they think about. Their main problems in terms of influence is the very barbaristic armed groups and sometimes even some members of the national armies that are guilty of human rights abuses. So instead of looking at things, in a very macro international way, we can also look at things from how they're coming from the field, because this is what we...
Those armed groups are not the proxies of foreign powers, is what you're saying.
Not necessarily. And sometimes, in the armed groups, people from other communities are also present. They're trying to broker domination over their neighbors.
All right, don't underestimate the domestic context in all this. Now, absent from today's talks, Algeria, where the Mali peace deal was signed in 2015. Last week, the French president paid his first trip to Algiers. Emmanuel Macron, since his election, and like all of his predecessors, well, he had to negotiate that symbiotic, sometimes resentful relationship. There he met with the Algerian prime minister. He also met Sheikh Noumar with the Algerian chiefs of staffs. Why are the Algerians not present in Paris today?
In fact, the elephant in the room is Algeria. Because, there's no need to recall that all this group, spawned off from the mountain area in Algeria with Drukdel and Abdelrazak El Para and
during the blood years of Algeria, there were these jihadists or these radicals, not jihadists at
just
the time.
Like in the
and they moved in.
Like in the Middle East, the Al Qaeda started off from Afghanistan and that spread off all over the area.
But they're the sworn enemies of the government in Algiers.
Yeah, but no, I want to point at the fact that there is something that is not clear about the Algerian attitude. We know that their argument is that their constitutions forbidden them from accepting any foreign troops on their soil or from participating in a military operation outside the territory, especially with the former colonial power. But I think that the situation is so serious that this argument is not valid.
Well, for them, it's also a matter of national pride, isn't it?
Yeah.
They're saying we don't want to be part of something that France is in charge of necessarily.
But the problem is that this Algerian attitude is, has some side effects in that the public opinion in this country tends to feel that the Algerians somehow are comfortable with the terrorist threat outside their...
Really? You think so?
But there is, a rumor about that, and there is a feeling about that. But anyway, I think that the African countries and the African Union should put pressure on Algeria and Morocco, because there is the problem of the Western Sahara, which is really a thorn in the thigh of the cooperation in the region. The Algerian role and
Michael Shurkin
should be, enhanced.
Michael Shurkin, how important is it, the fact that Algeria is absent?
I think it's very important. Algeria really is potentially a key player here. Algeria, for instance, has the military capabilities that none of its neighbors has. It has tremendous resources. Also, presumably, some of these groups also operate on Algerian soil. The Algerians really have the wherewithal to affect the entire struggle, but they don't. And I know there are, in fact, lots of rumors, conspiracy theories about why the Algerians don't do this. I generally don't countenance them, although one never really knows. But I think it's very short-sighted on the part of the Algerians to insist on, I think, these very arbitrary ideas about what they will and will not do out of their sense of national pride or their self-identity or perhaps simply their disdain for cooperating closely with France. I think Algeria needs to sort of stop defining itself as a decolonized state and think about itself more as a sovereign state and act as such. And I think Algeria could potentially play a very positive role in this region.
By the way,
really,
and by the way, Michael,
stand up and engage.
It's not just Algeria that's absent. There are other big regional players like Senegal that are not present, and some West African nations saying, "What is this club of G5? Why don't they have something that includes everyone? After all, the MINUSMA includes an African force. It includes already regional players. Why do we need this new layer?"
Well, the way I read the G5 is it's a way for the French to optimize their own engagement with these immediate Sahelian militaries with which it's already operating. So if you think about it, Barkhane operates bilaterally with each one of these militaries. But Barkhane, it's too small to do this effectively. And because France is desperate to try to strengthen collectively these militaries and make the whole be greater than the sum of the parts. So France's idea for doing that is then putting them together, which makes it easier for France to interact with them in an immediate way. So the G5 is a particular response to a particular problem. Senegal is not really relevant to this, and the Senegal were also willing to deploy soldiers and get their soldiers into the fight as the other countries are. Although I do believe that Senegalese soldiers are part of MINUSMA, so it's not that they're completely detached. But it's not a regional. I mean, it's a particular response to a particular need in a particular place and time that doesn't really involve other states. But Algeria really is too relevant to be on the sidelines.
Dugukolo Bakanai,
Yeah.
Algeria, part of the solution or part of the problem? What do you make of the fact that they're not present in Paris?
Well, I have two things to say. The first one is that yesterday, the permanent secretary of the G5 Sahel said that Senegal didn't approach G5 Sahel to integrate the organization. But both Morocco and Algeria have actually asked to be observers of G5 Sahel.
And you can be sure that Macron, when he had his meeting with the Algerian chiefs of staff, that they must have brought it up.
Yeah, definitely. And, you know, we mustn't forget that 4 years ago, when the intervention Serval happened in Mali, there was authorization by the Algerians to fly over the country. So I think that in terms of military tactics, there's a lot to be negotiated. And I don't believe that Algeria is going to be out of the problem or out of the solution at all.
So there's the rhetoric for public consumption, and then there's what's really going on?
Definitely, but I think that the mammoth in the room, to say so, because it's bigger than an elephant and it's also extinct or invisible, but it's also present and it exists, is the African Union. I think that the African leadership is something that is going to be necessary, because even for the G5 Sahel to be created, there was acceptance, there was an agreement with the African Union, but we need to see how to contain all these problems within the organization that already exists, knowing that a country like Nigeria, even though they have their own problems, they were very much interested in doing some work in Mali, but because of the leadership by France, they took a step back. So now we need African actors to convene together and to set their own agendas, because even though the Sahelian countries are part of the G5 Sahel, they're part of Africa and they speak among themselves. And France cannot be the only one leading in terms of policy. If there's an agreement on the African level, those African countries can also, they have some leeway to say what they want in terms of including others.
And what are the chances of the African Union being able to get everyone in the region to sing from the same hymn sheet?
Well, unfortunately, the African Union has very, low influence, especially when it comes to financial contribution. or that is the problem. The African Union just can set some guidelines and supervise agreement between the countries and something like that. But in terms of its own capacity and in the military field, on the financial field, but it's no secret that the African Union is very weak, to say the least of it. But I just wanted to point at two or a couple of things. First, on the military field, if you take MINUSMA, there are about, I don't know exactly, 8,000, 10,000?
Over that.
Something like that.
Yeah.
Barkhane, of course, is about 4,000. The G5 forces is, mapped to be about 5,000. To say nothing of the national armies, on the one hand. But on the other hand, what are the estimate of the manpower of the terrorist group? Less than 1,000.
Yeah.
So there is, is a lopsided.
But it's a question of real estate, isn't it? You have to patrol these vast areas, and on that score, let me ask, because we've mentioned the EU, we've mentioned the African Union, we haven't really talked about the United States so far. Back in October, 4 U.S. Special Forces ambushed and killed, along with 5 Niger soldiers, on what was described at the time as a routine patrol. That's triggered a full-blown investigation at the Pentagon and highlighted the challenges at hand. The Guardian newspaper, quoting an unnamed retired U.S. military officer, claims Niger forces ran when the fighting began, and that French Mirage jets refused to fire in inclement weather for fear of hitting the wrong targets. Eventually, it was French military helicopters that chased away the insurgents. Michael Shirkin, what's your takeaway from what happened in Niger back in October?
Well, one takeaway is clearly the Americans underestimated the level of threat in that part of Niger. The other is that there's insufficient coordination between the Americans, the French, and I would say the two of them, and the Nigerians. I've often noted that all of these players, United States, France, European Union, United Nations, engage in what I refer to as parallel play, like with 3-year-olds who will sit next to each other and play with their toys separately but don't actually interact. So anything that strengthens the coordination and the communications with these different players would be very good. From what I've heard, I've heard all sorts of stories about how the U.S. forces in Niger, they're soft, they couldn't talk to the French fighter planes, or I don't know exactly what happened, but they're not briefing each other. They're not aware. They don't know what everybody's doing. And anything that enhances that kind of coordination, I think, would be really welcome.
And that coordination can come how? Because we've heard that the French have the political connections locally, and the Americans have that great drone technology, most notably. How would it work in your view? How would it better work in that area?
Well, one way is to have a greater presence in each other's command centers. Again, I've never been in one of these in the Sahel, so I don't know. But I think it's fairly safe to assume that there aren't many American liaison officers in the French headquarters or French liaison officers in the American headquarters, et cetera. So at that operational level, there's a lot you can do to communicate with one another. And this is something that France and the U.S. are generally pretty good at when they're doing some sort of NATO operation. I think that there could also just be a lot more joint strategy or planning meetings that could be happening at the embassies, but in Bamako and Niamey, et cetera, as well as in Paris. I believe that at a very high level, there's very good cooperation, but at the lower, more operational level, there isn't such a great cooperation. It's a good idea.
Just briefly, because we're running short on time. Will the killing of those soldiers, because there's going to be an inquiry, there's going to be the results of the inquiry, there's going to be publicity, there's going to be bad publicity from all of this. Is that going to spook the Americans? Are they going to withdraw, or are they going to go in more forcefully?
I fear it might make the Americans go in more forcefully and bring more firepower to bear on whatever it is that they're doing. So, for instance, there's talk already. The Niger has authorized the Americans to deploy armed drones out of their base in Niger. So one might see much more robust use of firepower, which I think carries all sorts of dangers with it. So that's what I fear might be the case.
Dugukolo Bakonare, final comment on this?
For me, it's all about integration. Not only integrating the United States with the Center of Command of France, and not only integrating G5 Sahel into the African Union, but for everyone to speak together and also integrate the civilian population. And this is something that we have been trying with Kisal. We have been trying to talk to higher-ups in organizations, in governments about, saying that the strategy of bullying the population is not something that's going to make it easier to fight. It's going to make things worse for the population, for the government, for the states, for the continent. So we all need to sit down together. I was in Dakar for the Forum de Dakar on Peace and Security a month ago, and this is one thing that I believe that decision makers were able to hear. But now I think it's something that they have to set up. They have to get everyone together, because what happened in Niger was also, in my opinion, one result of not talking with the people enough.
Better to speak with each other. Dugukolo Bakonare, I want to thank you. I want to thank
you very much.
Ashek in Umar. I want to thank Michael Shurkin for being with us from Washington. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.